The third counterattack, again at the junction with the 885th Regiment, began at dusk. Now, supported by tanks, a full-blooded infantry battalion of the enemy was coming at us, and it is not known how it would have ended if our 2nd Battalion had not arrived in time. And although its personnel was dead tired, the battalion was immediately deployed to fight on the right of the 1st. And it turned out that the regiment not only repelled this, the third counter-attack of the fascists, but also went to pursue the retreating enemy. With a move captured his 2nd trench, began to push the fascists further. They chased the Nazis all night, and at noon on January 20th, having successfully forced the river Ositz near the town of Janovo, we entered directly into the territory of East Prussia. In East Prussia, our troops met empty settlements. Their inhabitants were partially evacuated, or even entire families were hiding in the forests, frightened by Goebbels' propaganda about the atrocities of the Russians. The cattle, pigs, sheep, poultry, closed-in farms, abandoned to their fate, raged with hunger and thirst. It was especially intolerable to hear the pitiful mooing of cows that had not been milked for several days. But there were settlements where the silence was sepulchral. Here even the cattle were all killed by their owners, as long as it did not go to the Russians, and on some farms our troops resisted. So, when approaching the worst company to one of them, standing by the road, it was fired from machine guns and automatic weapons. As it turned out, a group of renegade fascists from the local population, armed with 2 machine guns, Faust patrons, automatic rifles and grenades, were huddled in the attic of a 2-story brick building and at the water pump. It took the 1st Company, reinforced by a platoon of 45mm anti-tank guns, more than an hour to eliminate this pockets of resistance. In the evening, the regiment battalion by battalion deployed in 2 settlements, occupying a circular defence, put up a watchguard, organised duty at the machine guns and guns. For 4 days of continuous fighting, the personnel of the regiment was very tired, needed a good rest. We gave people such an opportunity, while strictly controlling the service of duty units and watchguard. For this purpose, in each battalion were sent representatives of the headquarters, political workers of the regiment. In the 2nd Battalion, for example, we sent the regiment's Komsomol leader, Senior Lieutenant N.A. Piatnitsky. Here he held a short Komsomol meeting at which the Komsomol members summarized the results of the battles, discussed the tasks that were to be solved directly on the enemy territory. By the way, on the eve of entry into East Prussia, Senior Lieutenant Piatnitsky, letter carrier, handed a curious letter. And now, speaking at the meeting, he said, "I want to read to you, comrades, a letter from a Soviet girl, a former partisan, and now living in the city of Saratov. This is what she writes. Hello, dear fighter. A great misfortune has befallen me. In the battle with the German fascist invaders, my dear brother died a hero's death. I know that he burned with sacred hatred for the vile enemy, so he fought without sparing his life. The government awarded him 3 battle orders. My brother was a very cheerful, energetic man, liked to sing cheerful songs. And now he is gone. I myself personally do not have the opportunity to avenge the death of my beloved brother with a weapon in my hands. So I ask you, dear fighter, to avenge the damned fascists for his untimely death, and I will help you to beat the enemy with self-sacrificing Stakhanov labor. With greetings, Nadia Zolotovina." Further, said the regiment's Komsorg, there is an inscription in the letter. I ask you to hand this letter to the bravest soldier. Who are we going to hand this letter to? There was a moment's silence, and then there were friendly voices. Sergeant Gorenkov! The sergeant took the letter from the hands of Senior Lieutenant Piatnitsky and excitedly said, I swear to you, dear girl, that I will fight the enemy mercilessly. And another thing, although your beloved brother died, he will still enter Berlin with us. He will be our memory of him. Looking ahead, I want to say that this oath Sergeant Gorenkov fulfilled with honour. Here is one of the episodes confirming it. Not far from Frischeshaft Bay, the fire of enemy machine guns delayed the advance of our soldiers. Then Sergeant Gorenkov, together with Afonin and Mironov, rolled out the gun on direct aiming and put a devastating fire on the fascists. With the first shots, they destroyed 2 machine guns of the enemy, together with their calculations. The way for our infantry was cleared. The soldiers broke into the enemy trenches. But this, I repeat, will be yet. And at the meeting, the regimental commissar once again called the soldiers to vigilance. And for this, there were very good reasons. After all, the day before there was such an incident. Having placed in a house on the northern outskirts of one settlement, we with the Chief of Staff were discussing the state of affairs in the regiment, when my orderly Sorokin came in and reported that the soldiers of the platoon of machine gunners, guarding the banner of the regiment, detained a wounded fascist. A few minutes later, the platoon commander, Lieutenant M.A. Guryanov, brought the detainee into the room. It was a big red-haired big man, dressed in civilian clothes. His head was bandaged, his left arm was in a sling. The suit was obviously too small for his height. His face has not been shaved for a long time. It is gaunt, eyes burning with fierce hatred. There could be no mistake, this is an SS man in disguise. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Guryanov reported that this subject was approaching our house from the rear. He had 2 hand grenades and a machine gun, and if he hadn't been spotted in time— Yes, the fascists are still fanatics. After a night's rest, the regiment continued to pursue the retreating enemy. Ahead, just a few kilometres, a small town of Jedwabno. Battalions on the march for a long time. People are tired, but it is still necessary to pass these kilometres. To the right of the route, 2 kilometres away, stretches a ridge of heights. Behind this ridge, as we know, goes the 882nd Rifle Regiment. Still, the heights worry us. There may be ambushes there. So I sent a group of scouts to them. The division commander drove up in a passenger car, expressed his displeasure with the slow movement of the regiment, said that there seems to be no enemy on those heights. If he appears, it will be somewhere near Jedwabno, where we should hurry up in order to seize this town by night attack, together with the 882nd Regiment. "I'm just heading to the 882nd, said the colonel, getting into the car. "How do you think to go?" I asked him. The commander pointed to the field road leading to the heights. "Wait for the return of my scouts?" I asked. But Colonel A.G. Cayley silently slammed the door and his car rolled towards the heights. Some anxious premonition seized me. Catching up with the vanguard battalion of the regiment, I shared with its commander my concerns about the fact that the division commander went to the 882nd Rifle on a country road. Meanwhile, the black Emka of the commander rolled farther and farther away. Here it has already covered a small grove. And suddenly from there heard bursts of shells, machine gun bursts. There was no doubt. The fascists were shelling Colonel Kali's car. Immediately I gave a command to Captain Kuznetsov. "Battalion, follow me. Run." Having jumped out on the northeast edge of the grove, we saw the commander's burning car and a dozen fascists running to it. Having open-aired fire on the move, the battalion right flank rushed to the MKA, and the left flank went to attack the heights. Hitleritis, running to the car, hearing our hurrah, and seeing the chain of fighters shooting back, turned back. From the heights on the battalion at once, machine guns, mines and shells began to burst. The battalion lay down. "First company, run to the car," I commanded Kuznetsov. The rest of the companies and mortars ordered to intensify fire in the direction of the bend in the road going to the heights. There are clearly visible 2 machine gun nests. Suddenly from behind and a little to the left showed a chain of the 2nd Battalion. Unwise. I ordered to go deeper around the heights. Suddenly from behind and a little to the left showed a chain of the 2nd Battalion. Unwise. I ordered to go deeper around the heights. Leaving the 1st Battalion, I ran towards the 2nd Battalion and directed it to the gully to the north of the grove, with the task to bypass the heights and attack the enemy from the rear. The fight lasted about an hour, But when the 2nd Battalion came to the rear, the fascists in panic threw their 2 field guns, wounded and killed, and jumping into armoured personnel carriers, withdrew in the direction of Jedwabno. Colonel Aturji Kali was dead. Several bullets had hit him, and one of them hit him in the head. The car was burned. The chauffeur and adjutant were badly wounded. The body of the commander was put on a wagon. Captain Kuznetsov built a battalion. A minute's silence, and then a triple salvo. We honoured the memory of the division commander. On the radio, I reported the death of Colonel Cayley to the Chief of Staff of the division. Meanwhile, the 2nd Battalion, having knocked the enemy from the heights, continued its pursuit. But soon from the division headquarters received an order to stop and consolidate on the reached boundaries. There to organise rest and food for the personnel, replenish ammunition, provide first aid and evacuate the wounded. In the evening came a new combat order. The regiment, continuing to develop the attack on Jedwabno on the morning of January 22 to ensure the entry into the breakthrough parts of the 3rd Guards Cavalry Corps. Further active actions took over its right flank. The regiment continued to pursue the enemy on the road to Passenheim, moving in marching order, when, overtaking the column, rode a few riders. One of them, wearing a burqa, rode up to us and told us to clear the road as they were being followed by the cavalry corps. The regiment was immediately given the command, "Take the right," and the men marched along the roadside. The horsemen rode on, and in a few minutes the regiment at a trot began to overtake the cavalry squadrons. The headquarters column also appeared. In front, in an open dodge, rode a group of cavalry commanders in black burqas and hats, also made of black caracul. Having equalled the head of the column of our regiment, the dodge stopped. "Who are they?" asked one of those sitting in the car. Someone from behind whispered to me, "Corps Commander General Oslikovsky." I went to the car, introduced myself to NS Oslikovsky, and then reported to him about the task of my regiment, to cover the right flank of his corps. Comcorps extended his hand to me, said hello, and said, "Well, infantry, let's keep up. Look, what a force is coming." On the right and left, overtaking the regiment, squadrons were passing at a brisk trot, artillery batteries, wagons with ammunition were moving behind them. Yes, it was an impressive sight. And this force is really big. But in this war this force, was very vulnerable. Especially it suffered from aviation, machine guns and massive use of artillery. In East Prussia, aviation, both enemy and ours, was limited in action by weather conditions. That's why so openly and entered the breakthrough cause of Lieutenant General N.S. Oslikovsky. Saying goodbye to me, Comcorps said that to cover his right flank, he also allocated one regiment and that we and his commander need to keep in closer touch. Passing the column of staff cars, I caught up with my lead battalion and ordered Captain Kuznetsov to accelerate the pace of movement. To which he replied, "Comrade Lieutenant Colonel, what if we put the personnel of the battalion on wagons? We have a lot of them, trophy ones, and there are enough horses." Well, the commander has a good idea. Literally in an hour, all 3 battalions of the regiment were already making an accelerated march, almost keeping up with the cavalrymen. The threat to the right flank of the cavalry corps was created by the retreating parallel parts of the tank division Great Germany, as well as the 558th and 129th Infantry divisions of the enemy. At midday, the scouts reported that to the right of our route to intercept the regiment is a column of enemy infantry with several self-propelled vehicles. What to do? I decided to continue the main force's movement in the given direction, and the 1st Battalion with the regimental artillery battery to preempt the enemy in capturing the heights on the right, not to give him the opportunity to go to the route of the cavalry. The 1st Battalion coped with the task brilliantly. It not only preempted the enemy and seized the heights, but, having repulsed several of his fierce attacks, began to push the fascists and move forward. At the end of the day, a cavalry lieutenant came to me, introduced himself, and said that his regimental commander was on a farm 1.5 kilometers from the road and, if possible, asked me to come to him to clarify the situation. Lieutenant Colonel M.T. Shevchenko, the commander of the cavalry regiment, met me warmly and friendly. He informed me in detail about the situation, said that their corps is moving in the direction of Allenstein, meeting on the way fierce resistance, Hitler writes. It is especially strong at the crossroads and in populated areas. Many disparate groups of fascists are now trying to break through our fighting order to Allenstein and in general to the west. His regiment commander of the corps stopped at this line. It was ordered to deploy part of the forces to the east and not to miss the enemy groups coming out of our rear. On the basis of information received from Shevchenko, I also decided to deploy one battalion to the east, to the right of the road, and the main forces of the regiment to concentrate battalion by battalion in the woods on the left, in readiness to act in any direction based on the situation. At 18 Mawag, Lieutenant Colonel M.T. Shevchenko received a radiogram from the headquarters of his corps, in which his regiment was offered to move on to Allenstein. We followed him. But somewhere around midnight came a radiogram from the commander of the 290th Infantry Division, ordering us to turn in the opposite direction, march and concentrate in the designated area, in readiness to take part in the offensive in the morning. The division, as part of the main forces of the army by this time, has already reached the front edge of the second fortified area of the enemy, created by him long before the war. In the offensive line of the army, it passed from Ortelsburg to Passenheim and further to Allenstein along the isthmus between the Masurian lakes. The shores of the lakes are almost everywhere high, precipitous, covered with dense pine forest. Dams were blown up everywhere, lowlands and ravines were flooded with water. Here against us stood significant losses, but still quite capable parts of the tank division, Great Germany, 24th Panzer Division, 558th, 129th and 299th Infantry Divisions, quite a few separate regiments and battalions. Sometime around 1 a.m. in the forest where the regiment arrived, we were met by a representative of the division headquarters and handed me a package. In it, the commander ordered us to move to the area of Interlake de Failes, in the forests northwest of Wartenburg, and, having come behind the Nazis, to advance in the direction of Passenheim, towards the main forces of the division. In the dark night, and even in the woods, it is quite difficult to get oriented, and even harder to choose the right path. Therefore, I asked the representative of the division headquarters whether he was ordered to lead our regiment to the specified area. He answered in the negative. He explained that he was ordered only to meet the regiment, hand the package to the commander, and himself immediately return back. We parted with the representative at a fork in the road, but which of them to lead the regiment on? We stood pondering. Some sixth sense suggested the one that goes to the left. We moved. And now, after the war, my front friends often ask me at meetings what helped me to choose the left road, and thus to fulfill the task. What to answer them? To refer to a sixth sense? Yes, everything happened in the war. We passed about 8 to 10 kilometres through the forest. It was already beginning to get light. The scouts came back and reported that ahead and a little to the right they came across the firing positions of the enemy battery. The gun crews were warming themselves by the fires. This news made us happy. We had come to the rear of the enemy. Besides, if the fascists were warming themselves by the fires, feeling carefree, it means that they were not expecting us from here, and taking advantage of this, we should attack suddenly, the whole regiment, without waiting for full dawn. I called battalion commanders and the chief of artillery to the head of the column. He gave them a task: complete silence, weapons and mortars to pull on hands in battalion fighting order. With the exit to the edge of the forest, attack. The signal is a series of red rockets, all battalions in line. Attack on the widest possible front to create the appearance of an offensive of large forces. The company of machine gun captain A.Z. Edigarov left in reserve. An hour later, the battalions began to stretch to the edge of the forest. No matter how much the commanders wanted to maintain complete silence, it was not quite possible. And hearing the noise from behind, in the forest, the Nazis immediately sent some soldiers in that direction. Those, having come across a chain of our infantry, raised the alarm. But too late. Our battalions, with a friendly hurrah, rushed into the attack. Meanwhile, I radioed the commander and reported that I had come to the rear of the fascists and was already attacking. Colonel N.A. Vyaznikovtsev, having listened to me carefully, pointed out on the map the boundary on which the regiment was strictly forbidden to go out, as in this case it could get under fire of its own artillery, and then informed me that in 15 minutes the 882nd and 885th regiments would also start attacking the enemy from the front and would develop the attack on the town of Jedwabno. Meanwhile, panic reigned among the Nazis. Throwing guns, artillerymen ran away into the woods. Infantry, allocated to cover them, rushed in the trenches, moving machine guns' barrels to their rear, but had no time to finish this task as shells and mines began to burst thickly in and near the trenches. It was the troops of the cause, and therefore our division, went on the offensive against the enemy from the front. As a result of the bypass manoeuvre, the town of Jedwabno on the same day was completely cleared of the enemy's 299th Infantry Division units defending it. Developing the offensive further, the units of our 290th Division soon seized the town of Passenheim. Then, turning steeply to the northwest, for 4 days fought hard in the interlake defiles with withdrawn here worn-out regiments of the 299th Infantry Division, supported this time by tanks and armoured personnel carriers. By the end of January 27th, the division fought southeast of the town of Wartenberg, and by February 1, its units were already on the outskirts of Gutstadt, reliably covering the right flank of the 35th Infantry Corps. By 3 o'clock in the morning, the red flag rose over this city. With the fall of Gutstadt, the situation for the enemy even more complicated. Our troops were approaching the outer rim of the Königsberg defensive line and were only 100 kilometres away from Friedrichshafen Bay, on the other side of which there was a narrow spit on, which Hitlerites evacuated to Danzig local burghers, food supplies, stole cattle. At this time we got the news that the commander of the German fascist troops in Prussia, General Gosbach, was removed from his post by the Führer, and together with him a number of senior officers. All of them were accused of allegedly deliberately surrendering East Prussia to the Russians. In Gosbach's place, Infantry General Müller was appointed commander. In addition to these measures, Hitler also issued an order, which was brought to all German soldiers and officers. It stated that every deserter would be shot as a traitor to the fatherland, and his family would be subjected to reprisals, their property requisitioned. Anyone who surrendered would be sentenced to death in absentia, and his family would again be sent to hard labour or to a concentration camp. Müller in turn also issued a number of similarly draconian orders. In particular, he initiated the creation of barrier detachments and the cleansing of rear areas, at the expense of whose personnel the combat units were replenished. Goebbels' propaganda was going out of its way to indoctrinate the demoralized soldiers and officers of the Führer that the plans of the Bolsheviks are about to collapse, that we must hold out a little longer, that in the rear of the German P created already large reserves, which will come to their aid. All this, taken together, to some extent strengthened the combat effectiveness of enemy formations. Already at the approach of our troops to Wormditt, which was part of the outer rim of the Königsberg defensive line, we felt that the enemy resistance has increased significantly. By the way, the Germans began to create the Königsberg defense line in the early 30s. In terms of its equipment, it differed little from the notorious Maginot and Siegfried lines on the Franco-German border. There were powerful reinforced concrete pillboxes connected with each other by a network of trenches and communication passages, dugouts for the personnel, which withstood direct hits of even the largest caliber shells, numerous armoured hoods. And in front of the wire fence in several rows were dug and anti-tank ditches, set thick minefields. On February 5th, our regiment, advancing on the left flank of the division, fought with the enemy in the forest area Wormditt-Terstadtwald. Against us acted only up to 2,500 Hitlerites, but it was not easy for the regiment, exsanguinated in the previous battles, to cope with these forces, moreover relying on the pillboxes, the network of which was spread along the glades and clearings. Before the evening, the enemy also undertook a strong counterattack. It was initially repulsed by the organised fire, but with the onset of dusk the situation worsened. Hitlerites began to stream around the regiment from all sides. It is necessary to do something. But what? It would be good, thought, to go to the rear of the enemy and a sudden blow from there to sow panic in his fighting order. But who to send? After a short thought, the choice fell on the reconnaissance platoon of Senior Lieutenant Mayakin. Stealthily leading his platoon into the enemy rear, Mayakin, dispersing the men in a chain, ordered them on command as loud as possible to shout "Hurrah!" to conduct on the move intense firing and throw grenades. In short, to create in the enemy the conviction that he was outflanked by a fairly large Russian force. And so they did. The fascists immediately began to panic, and the reconnaissance platoon, continuing to increase fire from automatic rifles, throwing grenades, began to move frontally through the forest, creating the appearance of encirclement. At the same time were raised in the attack and the rest of the regiment's units. Facing a double blow, the enemy began to hastily retreat. Pursuing him, we soon came to the Drevenets River, where we consolidated, waiting for the approach of the rest of the division. Having forded the Drevenets, our division, as well as other army formations, had already wedged into the second boundary of the Königsberg fortified area. Developing the offensive further, on February 11th, it stormed the town of Meginen, and again moved forward in the general direction of Melzach. The enemy units from the 19th Mechanized and 14th Infantry Divisions stubbornly defended this city. The brick factory with its massive buildings became the scene of particularly fierce fighting. It was located on the outskirts of the city. Here settled quite a strong garrison with 24 heavy machine guns. And yet, with the combined efforts of our and 882nd Regiment's brick factory, and then the city was taken. 1.5 to 2 kilometres north of Melzach, from east to west, stretches a hill with some dominating even above it heights. It was here that the enemy dislodged from Melzach and took a pre-prepared defensive line. The farms and outskirts of the settlements of Lilienthal and Gale were also adapted for long-term defence. The 290th Division was tasked to break through these defences and, developing the offensive in the direction of Breitlinde, by the end of the day to reach the highway leading from Breitlinde to Lindenau. It should be said that by the beginning of these hostilities our regiment numbered only 355 men. They were organised into 2 rifle, 1 mortar and machine gun companies in batteries of ATT, 76mm guns and 120mm mortars. Other regiments were of roughly the same composition. Thus, the 882nd Rifle had 450 active bayonets, in the 885th, 422. And yet at 14 Serts on February 22nd, after a short artillery preparation, the division units went on the offensive, or rather tried to go on the offensive, for the enemy, having pulled up reserves, concentrating self-propelled vehicles and infantry north of Lilienthal, almost immediately launched a counter-attack. And it so happened that from the offensive we turned into the defensive. From February 23 to February 25, we repeatedly tried to dislodge the enemy from the line he occupied. But all these attempts were unsuccessful. Hitlerites repulsed our attacks with powerful organised fire of artillery, self-propelled guns and machine guns. The regiment and other parts of the division in these battles suffered new and quite significant losses. To somehow make up for them, we had to carry out a severe reduction of rear and special units and replenish rifle companies with the released personnel. But the enemy also suffered heavy losses. Therefore, in the end, he was forced to leave the line occupied by him. Our units moved forward to a depth of 5 kilometres, and then stopped again, having engaged in fierce fighting. So kilometre by kilometre our troops went forward to the west, and the Nazis, due to the fact that the front line was constantly shrinking, Their command was able to densify the battle order by manoeuvring their though considerably shattered but still combat-ready units, and to break through the enemy defences became more and more difficult. In addition, the weather still did not allow our aviation to act in full force to support the exsanguinated in continuous fighting rifle units and formations. On February 5th, our regiment, advancing on the left flank of the division, fought with the enemy in the forest area Wormdiet-Terstadtwald. Against us acted only up to 250 Hitlerites, but it was not easy for the regiment, exsanguinated in the previous battles, to cope with these forces, moreover relying on the pillboxes, the network of which was spread along the glades and clearings. Before the evening, the enemy also undertook a strong counterattack. It was initially repulsed by the organised fire, but with the onset of dusk the situation worsened. Hitlerites began to stream around the regiment from all sides. It is necessary to do something. But what? It would be good, thought, to go to the rear of the enemy and a sudden blow from there to sow panic in his fighting order. But who to send? After a short thought, the choice fell on the reconnaissance platoon of Senior Lieutenant Mayakin. Stealthily leading his platoon into the enemy rear, Mayakin, dispersing the men in a chain, ordered them on command as loud as possible to shout "Hurrah!" to conduct on the move intense firing and throw grenades. In short, to create in the enemy the conviction that he was outflanked by a fairly large Russian force. And so they did. The fascists immediately began to panic, and the reconnaissance platoon, continuing to increase fire from automatic rifles, throwing grenades, began to move frontally through the forest, creating the appearance of encirclement. At the same time were raised in the attack and the rest of the regiment's units. Facing a double blow, the enemy began to hastily retreat. Pursuing him, we soon came to the Drevenets River, where we consolidated, waiting for the approach of the rest of the division. Having forded the Drevenets, our division, as well as other army formations, had already wedged into the second boundary of the Königsberg fortified area. Developing the offensive further, on February 11th, it stormed the town of Meginen, and again moved forward in the general direction of Melzach. The enemy units from the 19th Mechanized and 14th Infantry Divisions stubbornly defended this city. The brick factory with its massive buildings became the scene of particularly fierce fighting. It was located on the outskirts of the city. Here settled quite a strong garrison with 24 heavy machine guns. And yet, with the combined efforts of our and 882nd Regiment's brick factory, and then the city was taken. 1.5 to 2 kilometres north of Melzach, from east to west, stretches a hill with some dominating even above it heights. It was here that the enemy dislodged from Melzach and took a pre-prepared defensive line. The farms and outskirts of the settlements of Lilienthal and Gale were also adapted for long-term defence. The 290th Division was tasked to break through these defences and, developing the offensive in the direction of Breitlinde, by the end of the day to reach the highway leading from Breitlinde to Lindenau. It should be said that by the beginning of these hostilities our regiment numbered only 355 men. They were organised into 2 rifle, 1 mortar and machine gun companies in batteries of ATT, 76mm guns and 120mm mortars. Other regiments were of roughly the same composition. Thus, the 882nd Rifle had 450 active bayonets, in the 885th, 422. And yet at 14 Serts on February 22nd, after a short artillery preparation, the division units went on the offensive, or rather tried to go on the offensive, for the enemy, having pulled up reserves, concentrating self-propelled vehicles and infantry north of Lilienthal, almost immediately launched a counter-attack. And it so happened that from the offensive we turned into the defensive. From February 23 to February 25, we repeatedly tried to dislodge the enemy from the line he occupied. But all these attempts were unsuccessful. Hitlerites repulsed our attacks with powerful organised fire of artillery, self-propelled guns and machine guns. The regiment and other parts of the division in these battles suffered new and quite significant losses. To somehow make up for them, we had to carry out a severe reduction of rear and special units and replenish rifle companies with the released personnel. But the enemy also suffered heavy losses. Therefore, in the end, he was forced to leave the line occupied by him. Our units moved forward to a depth of 5 kilometres, and then stopped again, having engaged in fierce fighting. So kilometre by kilometre our troops went forward to the west, and the Nazis, due to the fact that the front line was constantly shrinking, their command was able to densify the battle order by manoeuvring their though considerably shattered but still combat-ready units. And to break through the enemy defences became more and more difficult. In addition, the weather still did not allow our aviation to act in full force, to support the exsanguinated in continuous fighting rifle units and formations. Here was severely wounded commander of the combined battalion Captain A.M. Larin. Instead of him in command of this unit took Captain M.M. Zagainov, head of intelligence of the regiment. In the area of the settlement of Deutsch Banau, the Nazis had built a wharf, used by them for evacuation of troops and military equipment. It was there, to the wharf, and had to break into Zagainov's battalion. First, under the cover of darkness to the pier penetrated the platoon reconnaissance platoon of Senior Lieutenant Mayakin. He began to pelt the fascists with anti-tank grenades, shoot them with automatic rifles, and this served as a signal for the whole battalion to go on the attack. By the morning of March 26th, the enemy was knocked out of Deutsch Banau. The regiment went to the coast of Friesches Haff Bay. In the first days of April, we received the order to load into the train, and only the personnel were loaded. Artillery units and supplies were to march to the designated area on their own. By April 11th, the division concentrated in the area of Klein-Kirschbaum, east of the Oder River. The entire Third Army made up the second echelon of the First Belarusian Front. For 10 days our units were replenished with personnel and weapons. There were classes on combat training, and on April 16th at dawn we heard a strong cannonade ahead. It turned out that it was the troops of the first echelon of the First Belarusian Front went on the offensive against Berlin. The Third Army entered the battle on April 23rd south of Berlin, was to act towards the troops of the First Ukrainian Front with the task to complete the encirclement of the Frankfurt-Guben grouping of enemy troops, and then in cooperation with neighbours to destroy it. This grouping consisted of 15 divisions of the 9th Field and 4th Tank Armies, and had 200,000 soldiers and officers, more than 2,000 guns and mortars, more than 300 tanks and assault guns. The terrain on which our troops were to operate was a forested area, with a chain of large lakes with only narrow isthmuses between them. There were also many navigable canals. Our immediate task was to close the ring of encirclement around the enemy grouping and cut the road Berlin, Zossen, by April 25th. And having completed the encirclement, not to go on the defence, to continue the offensive, more and more tightening the ring around the Nazi regiments and divisions. On April 23rd, our units, having started the offensive, by the end of the day had already crossed the Spree River and reached the line southeast of Nutzitau. And since dawn on April 24th, 878th Infantry Regiment, having received the task to cover the left flank of the corps, continued the offensive in the direction of Lake Tribsch, and during the day, having cleared from the enemy forests to the north and southeast of the Leke, captured the village of Alt-Garmensdorf. The next morning, units of the 290th Infantry began forcing the Dahme River. By noon it was completed. Having seized a bridgehead on the opposite bank, the division cut the road junction north of Königs Wusterhausen, and by the end of the day the division took possession of this settlement and captured the central Berlin radio station in full working order. On April 26th, at the boundary of the towns of Tofin and Grasbechten, as well as the forest on the western shore of Lake Gulden Sea, we had to fight hard with units of the 5th Panzer Division, the 169th Infantry Division, and the 501th Signal Regiment of the 9th Army of the Nazis. On the morning of April 27th, the division was ordered to advance to the southwestern outskirts of Wendisch-Buchholz. It organised its combat order as follows. Our 878th Rifle Regiment was on the right, and our 885th Regiment on the left. The 882nd Regiment was in the second echelon. As a result of a persistent daytime battle, we captured Gross-Keris and our left neighbour, Klein-Keris. On April 28th, our regiment, as part of the division, continued the offensive, meeting ever-increasing enemy resistance. A particularly fierce battle broke out in the evening when we approached the village of Lepten. It was surrounded on three sides by a forest, the most suitable place for the enemy to organise any trickery for us. That's why we went to the village with all precautions. But sent forward scouts soon reported that the village was empty, only along the clearing. From the south, the mechanised column of the enemy is moving to it. In the head, up to a dozen tanks, and behind them, armoured personnel carriers. It was necessary to capture Lepten as quickly as possible and organise on its southern outskirts of the defence. The 1st Battalion, under the command of Captres Bibicha, quickly moved to the planned outskirts of the village and met with fire the head of the enemy column, already stretching to the edge of the forest. The first tank was hit by the Paterovites, and the one coming from behind, not having time to slow down, rammed the head tank and immediately burst into flames. Confusion began in the column. Nazi soldiers and officers began to jump out of other tanks and armoured personnel carriers, but immediately fell under the accurate machine gun and machine gun fire of our soldiers. By this time, our mortar men, who had prepared for battle, also opened a quick fire in the forest. All attempts of Hitler's officers to bring any order among their soldiers had no success. The devastating fire of the 1st Battalion soldiers literally mowed down the panic-stricken fascist soldiers. Apparently, they did not want to surrender and could not go forward because the dense machine gun fire did not allow them to raise their heads. The ways of withdrawal were cut off by artillerymen, and in the very middle of this fire bag, our mortars were aptly hitting. A large group of the enemy, following in the tail of the column, tried to bypass the village of Lepten from the northeast. But by this time the 3rd Battalion had also prepared for battle there and met it with accurate fire. During the whole night the shots were not silent, and when dawn broke the fascists withdrew, leaving in front of the village and in the forest hundreds of corpses, 3 burned tanks, 12 armoured personnel carriers, several guns and mortars, many trucks and other equipment, reported the situation to the division commander. "What do you think to do next?" asked Colonel Vyaznikovtsev. "I will go forward, Comrade Colonel," I replied. "Right. Go to the village of Halbe," said the commander. "Your task is the same as before, to join the troops of the 1st Ukrainian Front. Forward, as always, went scouting. Scouts now and then radioed that in the forests between Lepten and Halbe they observed a large concentration of tanks, armoured personnel carriers, artillery and staff vehicles of the enemy. All of these are built on the sagebrush, in columns head to the west. In front of each column, a few tanks, then armoured personnel carriers with infantry, behind them artillery, and then staff cars. So the Nazis intend to break through not to the north, to Berlin, but to the west. Having consulted with the Chief of Staff, I decided to lead the attack with 2 battalions, letting them along the 2 main clearings. The 3rd Battalion left to defend in Lepten. The regimental artillery battery was located there as well, advancing 2 guns to the eastern edge of the village, to shoot the clearing and the edge of the forest, and the other 2 to fire along its main street. On the morning of April 29th, the battalions of the 1st Echelon drew into the forest and began to advance, so far meeting no resistance. But an hour later this deceptive silence was broken by gun salvos, bursts of shells and mines, and machine gun bursts. The 2nd Battalion was the first to engage the enemy. 12 tanks moved on it along the clearing at once, leading dense chains of infantry. Our fighters at first lay down, shooting back. But then, under the onslaught of superior enemy forces, they were forced to withdraw back to the village. The 1st Battalion captured by this time 2 favourable hills, from which several clearings were clearly visible at once, and began to shoot the columns moving along them with fire from all kinds of weapons. But dodging to the side, the Hitlerites coming from behind began to streamline Captain Bibich's battalion, and he soon found himself as if in the rear of the enemy. By noon, several columns of the enemy again appeared near the village of Lepton. Only this time they came to it from the east and southeast directions. The 2nd Battalion, already withdrawn by this time to the line of the 3rd, entrenched in the vegetable gardens of the southeastern outskirts of the village. And when the Hitlerites appeared on the edge of the forest, a friendly fire was opened on them. All day on April 29th and night on the 30th, this battalion courageously repulsed all attacks of the enemy, having destroyed 6 tanks, more than 24 armoured personnel carriers, and hundreds of fascist soldiers and officers. The commander of the 1st Battalion came on the line and reported that he was holding firmly on the heights. His losses were insignificant, but there was little ammunition left. There was no way to get to him yet. Therefore I ordered Bibech to hold on, save ammunition, using also captured weapons. At 1 o'clock in the morning, the silence that had fallen was broken by powerful gun blasts, the noise of tank engines and the crackle of machine guns. Hundreds of rockets hung in the sky. At the enemy everything came into motion. The command of the 9th Hitler's army made a last attempt to break through to the west, towards the army of General Wenck, which was striving for Berlin, on which Hitler so hoped. The battle lasted about 2 hours. We repulsed all enemy attacks, inflicting heavy damage on the enemy. With dawn, the firing on our section subsided. But on the right, in the direction of the town of Teupitz, which is near the Berlin-Dresden highway, the cannonade continued for a long time. As it turned out, a large column of the enemy, numbering more than 3,000 men, broke through there at the junction of 2 neighbouring divisions. But it was soon liquidated. So by the morning of April 30th, surrounded 200,000 Frankfurt-Guben grouping of Hitler's troops ceased to exist. Only I gave orders to the commanders of the 2nd and 3rd Battalions to continue moving forward, as I was called to the phone division commander. Said that he would soon be at my place, and not alone. Indeed, an hour and a half later, on the eastern outskirts of Leptena, came the commander of the 3rd Army, Colonel General A.V. Gorbatov, a member of the Military Council of the Army, Lieutenant General I.P. Konov, the commander of the 35th Rifle Corps, Lieutenant General N.A. Nikitin, our commander Colonel N.A. Vyaznikovtsev, and head of the political department of the division, Colonel I.M. Polyakov. I reported to the commander about how we repelled enemy attacks, and then offered to inspect the battlefield. Alexander Vasilievich replied that he had already seen when he passed how bravely fought the soldiers of the regiment, and especially the artillerymen. Indeed, the subordinates of Captain Chervontsev in this battle distinguished themselves. 4 tanks hit, about 100 corpses of Hitlerites lay in front of the firing positions of their battery. I saw in the middle of the village, the commander said in the meantime, a Nazi tank hit. He stood literally 5 meters from the gun, which was also broken by a direct hit of a shell. So both our and the Nazi gunner fired at the same time. But I was struck by another thing, how much stamina and courage it took for the gunner to let the Nazi tank get close to him and fire a shell into him for sure. I knew who the Colonel General was talking about. It was about Sergeant Rashchopkin's squad, who shot down 2 tanks that day. The last of them came close to the gun. Shots rang out simultaneously both from the enemy tank and from this gun. The crew of the TIV, which caught fire, was destroyed by another neighbouring Sergeant Eremin's crew. The commander and his entourage soon left the regiment. They, it turns out, decided to go around all the units and formations of the army, and our battalions, meeting almost no resistance, began to move through the forest towards the village of Halbe. The closer we moved towards it, the more clearly we heard the rumble of guns. It was the troops of the 1st Ukrainian Front advancing towards us. By noon on April 30th, in the village of Kalby, we met the troops of General V.Y. Kolpakcha, which were part of the 1st Ukrainian Front. And 2 days later we learnt about the capture of the Reichstag, the hoisting of the victory banner on it, as well as the fact that the demon-possessed Führer had committed suicide. By the end of the day, on May 1st, we received the order to march and concentrate in one of the areas of the northern outskirts of Berlin. The march was made in the daytime. By the evening of May 2nd, the regiment as part of the division made a stop for an overnight rest in Lichtenrede, which is on the southeastern outskirts of Berlin. This area, especially the adjoining cottage villages, was the least affected by the fierce fighting in the city. But at the same time, many Berliners flocked here. They were mostly old people, women and children. Therefore, we were ordered to place the personnel, if possible, in vacant or sparsely populated houses and cottages. A two-storey villa was chosen for the regimental headquarters, standing at the back of a small but very beautiful garden. When we drove up to it, the regimental engineer, Major P.S. Grishchenko, reported that the house and the garden area were checked. No mines were found. There were no owners in the villa. We went into the house. It was a richly furnished mansion. The eye was immediately drawn to the vast study, all filled with cabinets with books. On the desk there was a pile of papers and a massive marble inkstand. Around the desk were upholstered armchairs covered with yellow leather. Passing through the spacious hall, we stepped out onto the veranda. It led out into the garden, where the trees were already in full bloom. Turning to go back indoors, I instinctively peered behind the massive doors. Behind it, trembling with fear, stood a tall grey-haired man in his 60s, a middle-aged woman, and between them a young blonde girl. They were so frightened that they could not speak at once. We politely invited them into the room. Seeing such a favourable attitude to them, our captives gradually came to their senses and began to answer questions. The owner of the villa turned out to be a professor of mathematics at the University of Berlin, and with him were his wife and daughter. At the end of our conversation, we suggested that the owners stay with us or spend the night at the neighbours', and when we left, they could return to their home. We explained that Soviet fighters and commanders should not be feared, that they were not fascists and would not hurt anyone. The professor and his wife decided to spend the night upstairs in their daughter's room. Their fear had completely dissipated. On the morning of May 3rd, the commander summoned the commanders of the units and announced that the division was ordered to forced march to the Elbe River. An hour later, the regiments were on their way. On the outskirts of Brandenburg, we were resisted. We entered into battle with the rear guard units of the enemy, covering the withdrawal of Nazi troops to the Elbe. They were in a hurry to reach the river to surrender there to the Americans. The enemy defence was in the forest, consisted of separate pockets of resistance, covering mainly the nodes of roads leading to the west. Our regiment already had experience in forest fighting, so the battalions quite easily knocked down the enemy rear guard and continued along the specified routes. Up to the Elbe remained a little more than 30 kilometres. On the line of headquarters, we were informed that the American troops are on its west bank. Apparently, the fascists knew about the fact that the Americans came to the Elbe, because they hurried there in groups and alone. Many of them changed into civilian clothes, sneaked to the Elbe through the forests at night, and during the day they hid in the attics of houses in haylofts. Those who fled in groups and in military uniforms, if it was impossible to avoid collision with our units, tried to fight their way through. And here it is, the Elbe, in front of us, wide, fast. Everywhere, wherever you look, from the Iller Canal to the eastern bank, the river floodplain is covered with damaged, burnt and simply abandoned enemy equipment. It's a mad and senseless jumble. And through this fantastic dump, hundreds of former soldiers and officers of the Führer are making their way to the water's edge in groups and alone. They hurry to cross to the other side of the river on barges, boats, and some of them simply swim, grabbing the first log or snag. Faster to the other side, faster to surrender to the Americans, but not to the Russians. That was the picture I saw when I went with one of my battalions to the eastern bank of the Elbe west of Paris. The Allies, having noticed the Soviet fighters pursuing the fleeing Nazis, salute from the western bank in our honour. But they do not forget those whom we are pursuing. They give hands to those who swim to the western shore, help them to get on land, and take them somewhere quickly. However, the next day the Americans returned some of the prisoners of war to us. It turns out that our command demanded from the commander of the 102nd American Infantry Division to return the prisoners, justifying this demand by the fact that we certainly could not fire on the fleeing fascists, neither from cannons nor from mortars, not even from machine guns, for fear of catching any of the Allies. And it was this that enabled many Hitlerites to safely cross the river and surrender to them. Victory Day parts of our division, as well as the rest of the Third Army, met a few dozen kilometres east of the Elbe. The thing is that in the morning of May 8th, we received an order to transfer the occupied area on the eastern bank of the river to the units of the 3rd Shock Army. We were withdrawn to the rear. By the evening of the same day, our regiment was concentrated in the forests north of the town of Plaue, and at night, sometime after 2 o'clock in the morning on May 9th, I received a call from the division commander, Colonel N.A. Vyaznikovtsev, and congratulated me on the end of the war. He informed me that the act of unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany had already been signed. This joyful news flew around the whole regiment by lightning. Hundreds of flares soared into the sky. Jubilant shouts of hurrah were heard. 6 May 9th, 1945. The regiment was built with the unfurled banner. Friendly hurrah now and then drowns out the speakers. The joy of all soldiers and commanders is uncontrollable. After all, the victory. 18 days and nights we went to it, and we reached it. After breakfast came a radiogram from the division commander. In it, he also congratulates the personnel of the regiment on the great victory. Just read it to the people, as the duty officer on the regiment reported the order of the division headquarters transmitted by phone at 12 wows to build the division units for a parade to commemorate the great victory of the Soviet people over Nazi Germany. Then the coordinates of the place of the formation were indicated. 10 Toyaku. The command sounds, to the banner, halt! From the left flank appears the standard-bearer of the regiment's senior lieutenant, A.S. Mayakin, our dashing scout. The motherland appreciated his exploits. The gold star of the hero of the Soviet Union burns on his chest. Next to Mayakin step Assistant Senior Sergeant G.I. Shevchenko and Sergeant A.M. Abramov. They are from the reconnaissance platoon, on the chest also ringing numerous orders and medals. Froze formation. Faces of soldiers and commanders turned to the battle banner of the regiment, to the banner which we carried through all the trials, from the walls of Moscow to the shores of Elbe, until victory. The division is built in the letter P, in the order of numbering of parts. On the right flank, our 878th Rifle Regiment, in the middle, 882nd, then 885th Rifle Regiment. The battle banners of the units are fluttering in the wind, on which the orders are also shining in the bright sunlight. Under the rolling hurrah and the sounds of the counter-march, Colonel N.R. Vyaznikovtsev drives around the regiments and greets them. Then the commander's car stops at a makeshift podium. Climbing on it, the colonel excitedly talks about the combat path of the division, the heroic feats of its soldiers and commanders. He ends his speech with congratulations on victory. After the commander spoke representatives of the units. From the 878th Rifle Regiment, the floor was given to Senior Lieutenant A.S. Mayakin. Before closing the meeting, the head of the political department of the division, Colonel I.M. Polyakov, proposed a minute of silence to honour the memory of the soldiers who died a brave death in the battles for freedom and independence of our homeland. Then said a greeting in honour of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, which led us to victory in the Great Patriotic War, in honour of the Soviet people and its valiant Red Army. The meeting is over. The orchestra plays Internationale. The salutes of the gun salute rumbled, the hurrah sounded for a long time. Then a large table covered with red cloth was placed in front of the tribune. On it laid out a lot of boxes. Chief of Staff of the division, Lieutenant Colonel P.K. Kuzmin, read orders to award orders and medals to soldiers and commanders who distinguished themselves in recent battles. Twice I was called to the table. I was awarded the Order of the Patriotic War of the First Degree for the capture of the Prussian city of Braunsberg and for the regiment's access to Friedrichshafen Bay. The Order of the Red Banner was awarded to me for participation in the defeat of the encircled Frankfurt-Guben grouping of Nazi troops south of Berlin. May 18th, in the city of Berg, held a meeting of generals and officers of our Third Army with representatives of the 9th American Army. I was invited to the meeting, among others, organized the reception of American guests our commander, Colonel General A.V. Gorbatov, and a few days earlier, a delegation from the troops of the Third Army visited the 102nd American Infantry Division at the invitation of its commander, Major General Kitinda. That reception was held in one of the ancient castles of the city, amidst a large green park. The friendly, I would even say, benevolent attitude of the Americans toward us, Soviet officers, was immediately striking. I am describing this meeting and my impression of it because just a year and a half later, when I had to serve as commander of the regiment guarding the southern sector of Berlin, this attitude became absolutely opposite, if not hostile. And it was explained quite simply. It was all about the policy, which the US government began to pursue in relation to the USSR. But then, in May 1945, at the meeting in Berg, everything was still different. The victorious soldiers, baptized by the fire of battles against the common enemy, German fascism, met. The official part consisted of exchanges of greetings of our commander and the American general. Then our generals and officers were presented with American orders and medals. Among the awardees was myself. After the awarding, a dinner was held. It was held in a friendly atmosphere with the usual Russian hospitality. So it was May. The war was over, and all of us, from ordinary soldiers to generals, had one wish: to return to our homeland as soon as possible. And it happened. Sometime in the first days of June, we received the order to march to the Soviet Union. We had 2 days to prepare for the march. Then it was 3 months on the road. Our division was placed by the district command in 3 military towns. In one of the Belarusian towns settled the division headquarters and our 874th Regiment. The 805th Rifle and Artillery Regiments occupied a military town northwest of the city. By the way, the division units approached this town already at the end of September, and since the military towns were badly destroyed, we decided to camp the regiments in the forests until they were put in order. Our regiment was allocated 1 3-storied barracks and an adjacent dilapidated military town. By the way, this barracks had its own history. During the First World War, the Russian Army headquarters was located here at one time. Now the barracks is mostly preserved, except for the fact that its right rear corner was penetrated from the top to the very foundation by a Nazi bomb, and the end wall had a significant tilt. There was only enough room in the barracks for battalions. For the rest of the units, it was necessary to build another one, and, in addition, a stable for 130 regimental horses. There was not even a building for the headquarters, for warehouses, housing for the families of officers. A lot of them had already arrived. And I must say that thanks to the initiative, good organizational skills of officers, hard work of soldiers and sergeants, we coped with this task. Barracks, with the help of local party and Soviet bodies, was repaired. 2 more buildings were restored, one for the headquarters, the other for the House of Officers. For the families of the officers built 2 apartment houses for 60 apartments each, 2 stables and warehouses. Hay, potatoes, vegetables were prepared. By November 4th, everything was ready for the reception of units. And on November 5, the inhabitants of the city met their liberators. Representatives of the Central Committee of the Communist Party and the Council of Ministers of Belarus, the commander of the troops of the district, Lieutenant General V.N. Razuvayev, a member of the Military Council, guests from the nearby state and collective farms came to the meeting. Everywhere still gaping ruins of buildings, unhealed wounds of war. After all, a little more than a year has passed since the battles in Belorussia thundered down, and it will take more than 1 year to restore all these destructions. But still the city is festively decorated with banners, flags. People are in a good, festive mood. The city square, sidewalks of the main street are filled with jubilant people. Girls in smart national costumes handed our soldiers bouquets of autumn flowers. And in the evening, the lights of festive fireworks lit up the sky of the city. Peaceful life and peaceful combat training began.